My name is Madeline. I go by Maddie Schreiber, and I am a professor in the Geosciences department at Virginia Tech. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and travels and sort of my path in geohydrology. My STEM story, I guess, started in high school. I was always interested in science, but when I went to college, I started as a history major, and my goal was to go to law school. But I ended up taking a geology class. It was a requirement for my minor in environmental studies. And so as I took that class, I fell in love with geology, and I changed my major to get a BA in geology. But some other experiences in doing field work and in undergraduate research really got me super interested in geosciences. And I switched to a bachelor's of science degree in my senior year, and that's what I graduated with. So after college, I worked in environmental consulting for 2 years in Boston. And in that job, I mostly worked at contaminated sites that had water and soil with contamination, mostly at Superfund sites in New England. So these are big toxic waste sites that are managed by the Environmental Protection Agency. During that time, I did a ton of field work. I learned a lot, did quite a bit of report writing. And it also piqued my interest in the issue of water contamination. After that, I actually took a little bit of a turn in my career path, and I decided to volunteer for the Frontier Nursing Service in Kentucky, which was actually the first midwifery school in the US. And that was a key personal experience for me, not related to geology, but just a key personal experience. And after that, I did decide to go to graduate school. I started in a Master's of Science program in hydrogeology. And during that time, I realized I enjoyed teaching. And so I decided to continue for a PhD. And so the key experiences during my graduate school life were doing a lot of field work, doing independent research. I did a summer internship with the Department of Energy, and also teaching, which ended up being a really important passion for me, which I didn't realize that I was going to like teaching until I did it. And so that leads me to the faculty position at Virginia Tech. I've been here for 22 years. I teach a variety of courses to undergrads and graduate students, and I also get to do research. And past 5 years or so, I've been doing some administration as well. So my research group looks at contamination of water. And so that's kind of our broad goal. We work on a variety of different projects involving chemicals, contaminants, and water supplies. So these pictures show my group. These are students that have been around in the past year or two. And I like to show them in the field doing their research because that's where they're happiest. So our research involves fieldwork, lab experiments, and computer modeling. So the pictures on the left side show us in the field, and the bottom left picture shows us doing work during the pandemic. So it did slow us down a little bit, but we were still able to do field work, which was terrific. The middle two slides show students in the lab. We do a variety of different lab instruments. We use techniques from other fields. I do work in anaerobic microbiology. I do some work in nanoscience, and both of these are in collaboration with other scientists. And then the right-hand picture shows some results from computer modeling, which we use to predict future scenarios. And it allows us to see what might happen to a contaminant if we were to treat it a certain way. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of examples of research. This first example was from the Dan River coal ash spill, which some of you might remember. It seemed like it was just a few years ago, but it was actually in 2014. And after that coal ash spill, which happened in the Dan River again, this was in south of Martinsville in Eden, North Carolina. And this was at a power plant that used to be a coal-fired power plant. And they had stored quite a bit of coal ash next to the plant, which was adjacent to the Dan River. And you can see those ash basins in the picture on the left. Underneath that primary ash basin, there was a culvert that failed, and it released a lot of coal ash into the Dan River. And that's what the pictures on the right show, that grayish material in contrast to the brown material. The brown material is just the natural river sediment, and the grayish material is the coal ash. So we were able to get some funding from the National Science Foundation to examine how metals get released from coal ash into rivers. So the way that we approached this problem was to first collect samples. So that was part of our field work. And you can see pictures on the left showing me at the top in a kayak, in a canoe, I'm sorry, going down the Dan River, collecting samples. And then an undergrad who worked with me had a shovel and a bucket and collected samples that way. So some of our sampling techniques are pretty basic, but the goal is to collect good samples that we can bring back to the lab. And in the middle shows pictures of our density separation method. So what we were trying to do here was separate the ash from the river sediment. And that filter picture at the bottom shows the concentrated coal ash that we have separated from the river sediment. And then the picture at the right shows a grad student, Rui Saramaya, looking at that coal ash using a type of microscopy called scanning electron microscopy, so we can see close-up pictures. So I wanted to show some pictures up close and personal of coal ash. I think these are really interesting visually, and they tell us a lot about how the coal ash behaves in the river environment. So the picture on the left just shows what's called a cenosphere. It's just a hollow sphere that's made of aluminosilicate that's amorphous. And it's broken and you can see that it's hollow inside. There's a scale bar at the bottom that you might not be able to see very well, but it's 50 microns. So it's a very, very tiny little hollow ball. The picture in the middle shows also another cenosphere, but this one is coated with iron. And iron is well known to attract trace elements like arsenic, which is something I'm particularly interested in. And so we took a closer look at that iron-rich coating to see what kinds of trace elements were there. And on the right-hand side shows a piece of char, which is basically the leftover of the coal once it's been burned. And you can see there's a lot of pore spaces. There's lots of little spheres in there, lots of iron-rich coating. So it's a very complicated type of material. And our next process was to go even further into the nano world. And this was really interesting to go in and look at these tiny, tiny particles. This one in the picture is 200 nanometers across. So it's just incredibly small. And we're able to not only visualize these particles, but we're able to do chemical analysis of it. So this particular particle contains quite a bit of iron, which, as I said before, attracts trace elements. And it also contained trace concentrations of lead. And lead is a well-known trace element in coal ash, and something that we were very interested to learn, that it was transported with coal ash down the Dan River after the coal ash spill. So this next example, I'm going to show this to you more conceptually, and this has to do with work that we do in drinking water reservoirs. So these are important water sources for all of us who have drinking water on a public water supply. Some of us have our own wells, but many of us drink water from these surface reservoirs, and they're operated by water authorities who are charged with making sure that that water stays clean. One of the challenges of working in reservoirs is that there's often naturally occurring minerals that can be released to water and cause water quality problems. So in this example, we're looking at a cross section through a reservoir, and there's lots of oxygen in this water, and there's a happy fish in the middle. And at the bottom, you can see in the sediments, there are metal oxides. So for example, manganese and iron oxides, and they are stable in that bottom sediment as long as there's oxygen in the water above. But what happens during the summer months is that the sun heats up the water surface, which causes a thermal and density stratification of the water. And so that leads to a multi-layered reservoir system where we have the top waters called the Hypolimian, and the bottom water is called the Hypolimian, and it's separated by something called the thermocline. And as this starts to separate, the hypolimnion becomes detached from the atmosphere. It becomes isolated from the atmosphere. And microbes will start to deplete the oxygen as they're, chewing up and eating organic matter. They will deplete the oxygen. So when the oxygen gets depleted in the hypolimnion and there's no replenishment of that oxygen from the atmosphere, those metals that were once stable in the sediment will actually be microbially reduced to a soluble form of metal that's then released to the water column. So under these conditions where we have no oxygen in the hypolimnion, we can end up with high concentrations of metals in the water. And so what we do in coordination with water authorities is we operate hypolimnetic oxygenation systems, meaning we pump oxygen into the bottom waters. And the goal is to promote oxidation of the metals and basically take them out of the water column. So after that oxygen enters the hypolimnion, we have nice, lots of oxygen in the hypolimnion. There's a nice happy fish, and the metals actually oxidize and drop out of the water column back into the sediment. So this type of treatment process is something that we study the whole cycle of the metals, and we look at all of the different processes that affect metals with the goal of trying to prevent the hypolimnion or the drinking water from becoming contaminated with metals. So one thing I'll say about my work is that we get to do a lot of fun field work and we get to travel to really beautiful places. I've had the opportunity to travel to Thailand to do field work there. I've gotten to work in beautiful locations and rivers and lakes and reservoirs. I also get to look at rocks, which makes me happy. So this job has a lot of fun aspects to it. So I will also say that collaboration with students and with other scientists is really critical for our research. So I have a couple pictures here of different research groups that I work with on campus as well as around the United States. And in these pictures, most of the people in these pictures are students. And I will say that most of the work that I do is in collaboration with students or with other scientists. There's very few things that I just do on my own. So if there are students who are interested in geology and or hydrology, there are just some ideas that I had for good backgrounds or skills to develop. One is working on field observations. So really just going outside and looking around, going on field trips and just spending time outside, I think, leads to the ability to make field observations. Thinking in 3 dimensions is a helpful skill, especially as a geologist. Writing is an important skill, and I know sometimes students going into science don't necessarily think that writing's important, but that's how we communicate our science is through writing. So that's something we work on a lot at Virginia Tech, as well as other forms of communication, oral communication, and data communication. Our students really in geosciences rely on a broad background in other core sciences like biology, chemistry, and physics. And they do need a strong background in math, statistics, and we teach them coding in our program, but it's always helpful to get experience in coding. And one requirement really for geoscience students is to learn GIS, because that's really the way that we basically visualize all of our data is in geographic information systems. So for supporting students to gain experiences in this area, I would encourage students to participate in informal education programs through 4-H, through museums. We have a wonderful Museum of Geosciences here at Virginia Tech. Any opportunities to volunteer for any kind of outdoor projects or science projects. Coming to the Virginia Science Festival allows students to see the breadth of science that and all the exciting things that scientists get to do. Participation in research projects or in science fairs is always a wonderful experience for students. Connections with local universities, and really I think for students in our program, the students that I think are most successful are the ones that are curious about the world. So I would say encouraging that curiosity is one of the main things that I try to do as a teacher at Virginia Tech. So yeah, so thank you for listening, and please feel free to reach out with any questions. My name and my email address are located here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If we were in person, we'd all clap for you, which is normally what we all do.
Thank you.
But I'll clap for you by myself instead. Otherwise, I feel like it's awkward, right? We do have some questions, and I'll probably build off of some of these questions as well. So you mentioned GIS, right? And I guess, so I actually went to a university that was huge in geography, and GIS is one of their big claims, is that they do GIS there. And I guess, so one of the questions we have here is, do you know some resources for students, or I guess I would imagine teachers too, to learn about GIS on their using?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say that honestly, especially during the pandemic, there's a lot of stuff that I've just done through Coursera or just online free courses that, and I did something through edX on data science during the pandemic. It's always hard to do something like that because, there's no grades or anything. So it's sort of self-motivated. I also took a philosophy class that I didn't realize was going to be so hard. So I didn't actually I didn't get very far in the philosophy one, but I did a better job with the data science, and I was able to learn some R programming along the way. So I would recommend that just as a way to get a flavor of GIS. At a place like Virginia Tech, in our geosciences program, we actually require students to take GIS because we hear from employers how important it is for the students to have that background. So we don't even let them have the choice, we just make them take it.
And I guess, so what kind of data are you using GIS to visualize?
So we use GIS for a lot of things, just even mapping. So putting topographic maps in GIS in the field so we can map rocks and be able to know where the rocks are located. We use also GIS for looking at and hydrology. We use it for predicting the direction of water flow. And we can use it to outline watersheds in a way that is much more accurate than just using a standard topographic map. And in the industry, even just making maps in GIS, even just simple location maps is a really important skill to have. So it can vary from something very simple like making a map to super complicated equations and calculations.
Awesome, thank you. And then so another question we have here is, how do you find so you talked about a couple of projects you work on, how do those projects come to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So sometimes it's me, going out and making, writing a grant proposal on something that I'm interested in. Sometimes I've gotten some projects where I have a collaborator who says, hey, do you want to work on this project? The Dan River project, actually, someone from Cornell reached out to me, and that person was interested in working. They heard about the Dan River coal ash spill and reached out to me and said, hey, are you working on this? And I said, no. And he said, well, do you want to write a grant proposal with me? I said, sure. So, I got involved through the Dan River through someone from upstate New York. So it really depends. Some of it is initiated by me. Sometimes people come to me with ideas and projects. So that's why it's really fun. I've said no to some things that I'm not interested in, or I don't really have the expertise to help with. So, that sometimes happens too, where I maybe don't really see how I can get involved. But for the most part, I'm pretty open and receptive when someone comes to me with an idea.
Okay, and then only because you didn't touch on this, but what are the outcomes? What kind of what happens with the research and work that you've done? So
of course we're academics, so that we publish our work. So that's the thing that I'm supposed to do when I get grant money is train students and publish my work. So for the most part, we try to have as many peer-reviewed publications as we can from projects, because that's how we're kind of evaluated. But also sometimes our work is helpful for water managers. So for example, there may be problems that people have with a certain type of contamination, and we've been able to help them avoid that contamination, or figure out a way to treat the water in such a way so that the water contamination is remediated. So our work has both kind of academic impacts, and it does also have some practical impacts.
Yeah, actually, we had a presenter one time who was talking about, I think it was adding limestone to reservoirs, and he was working at a JMU, just north of you. So, and to keep, I forget what he was doing that for, but it was just really interesting. He was like, "Oh yeah, no, it's this whole thing you have to do with like limestone in reservoirs and rivers to make sure that the pH is correct, so that way things can live." And then, all of these other like cascading, things that happen. He was just like, we just get reports on like when it needs to happen, and we have a pretty good record of like, the timing of when we, the last time we added limestone, and when we might need to do that again, based on whatever.
Yeah, that's for treating. I bet it's for treating acid mine drainage, because I worked on a project a couple years ago on that, where we added limestone to treat acid mine drainage, and it was a really interesting project. Again, really practical results.
I guess so, like, and I don't know if you know this because you're more on the like hydrology, geology side, but when we're how long does it take for like native species populations to come back from some of these spills, or if there's minerals, like in the example that you shared?
Yeah, that's a great question. Since I'm not a biologist, I'd have trouble answering that. I know that some species are actually quite contaminant tolerant, which is a little scary, but there are some organisms that just have figured out how to live in certain environments. And I've worked at sites with really high arsenic concentrations. And I will say that the macro invertebrates get wiped out, but the bacteria, they figure it out. They know, the bacteria know how to process the contaminants. And in fact, they can thrive in contaminated environments. I think for something like the coal ash situation, I think it was initially, there were problems just because of the number of particles in the river, and that, gets into fish gills, and it causes problems with, ecosystems. But as soon as the ash settles out, I think it's more of the long-term impact of, organisms that will burrow down in the sediment. And if you have these trace elements like lead and arsenic in the sediment, is that going to impact growth? So other people have worked on those kinds of projects, and I've just, kind of been on the periphery of that.
And actually, so one more question, and it's a personal interest question of mine. So I have a lot of family in the State College area of Pennsylvania. And they actually, there's been, from what I understand, they don't dredge any of their rivers because the thought is that it's too expensive to kind of disrupt all of the sediment that's down there, and it's since been papered over by other sediment. And so in an effort, they're more concerned about disrupting any of the sediments that are up there. And that being more ecologically damaging than just letting it lie, because one, it's expensive. This is all the things that I've heard, and because I guess it's expensive, and they're just really, some people don't do a great job of stuff like that. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's funny because, not funny, but in the Dan River, they did have to dredge in locations where the coal ash had accumulated. So, and actually we were there, this was down in Danville, and we got to actually go sample while they were dredging. And what they did is they tried to find the places where a lot of coal ash would accumulate and then dredge. And I think that type of treatment is, there's always a balance between, is it what's the cost and benefit of dredging and removing this versus just letting it sit there? And I think it really depends on the situation. If you have something like coal ash, over time that might cause disruptions with organisms who live down in the sediment, but during the dredging process, you're certainly releasing a lot of particles to the stream, and that also impacts the ecosystem. So there is that cost benefit.
Awesome.